They had opened the gates to allow the force that began to amass enough space to gather. The massive company of soldiers, both mounted and on foot, was far greater than the one that had attacked the camp earlier. It was like a sea of silver that ran from the courtyard and out through the high gates, flowing like a continuous stream. As the last of the forces left on foot, the small wooden caravans followed, each pulled by 2 large horses. One contained at least 3 elven prisoners, and the other, Adora herself. It was transparently clear that they were profoundly uncomfortable by the way they were packed into their cages, atop wooden platforms that were attached to 2 massive wooden wheels. The caravan rocked violently whenever the heavy wheels struck uneven ground. Adora sat within the dark space, her hands bound tightly, her green eyes fixed intensely on the distant horizon. Rian sat upon his steed, and beside him was Garth upon his own mount. Rian felt deeply reluctant to get going. It felt as though every single time he left these protective stone walls, someone had either got hurt or died. "We'll be okay, right, sir?" Garth said abruptly, drawing in on his reins a little. Rian did not know how to respond to this. He did not want to lie to his friend, but at the same time, perhaps feigning that they were going to be perfectly fine was the best way forward to keep his spirits up. "Yes, of course. Just whatever happens, stay close to me." Garth smiled towards Rian, feeling an immense sense of relief at the reassuring words his friend had just uttered. He released a long, deep breath into the vigorous cold. "Okay, let's go." Garth whipped the reins softly against his steed and kicked his heels into its side. As he did, Rian noticed something hanging fully outside the boy's vest, resting along his chest. It was a necklace of sorts. It was entirely new, however, and looked rather ornate, perhaps the very trinket he held onto so tightly earlier. The horse neighed sharply and took off into a slow trot. Rian proceeded to do the same. Once the massive city gates closed behind them, a sudden feeling of absolute unease hit him. He wished desperately that he could possess the confidence of the hundreds of soldiers that galloped in front of him. But he didn't. War was an entirely new and alien thing to him. But had it been before his amnesia? He thought of everyone he had encountered up to this point since waking. The little old lady Sigrid who had helped him, the blatantly arrogant soldier Varric, his young friend and companion Garth, and Zarek, whom he had notably not seen as he left the city, nor anywhere amongst the large company that now rode to war. The pace had quickened. The horses in front of him stirred up to a steady, rhythmic run, and Rian followed suit. The frozen ground beneath him fell away and blurred as he rode faster into the twilight. Behind him, the wooden caravans rattled vigorously under the immense strain of how fast their steeds were pulling. He glanced back one final time. Nostrador stood silent and imposing upon the ridge. The high walls looked smaller than he remembered, and the dense trees that surrounded the perimeter looked like dark, looming figures leaning over into its gray stone walls. Rian looked ahead, trying to see if he could spot Varric, who he assumed rode at the absolute head of the Nostrador forces. There must have been at least 7 full companies that had left the city gates, each containing 40 mounted soldiers, riding in tight columns 4 horses wide. They took up more than a third widthwise of the dirt road they traveled on. "We ride through the night!" a voice shouted from the front, being echoed mechanically from one company to the other, so that everyone down the line could hear the message. Surely we will stop at some point before that, Rian thought to himself. Their horses and their riders would desperately need to rest, to eat and drink. Garth must have been thinking the same thing as he rode his horse closer to Rian's flank. "He's going to kill us before we even get to our destination," Garth jested with a nervous laugh, before pulling his horse away and drifting back to his original position in the column. Rian made the firm decision to ride on ahead of his company, as well as the others, to try and locate Varric and hear what he had to say on the matter of riding through the freezing night. Fortunately, the ride towards the head of the army was quick, as he guided his horse along the side of the road and onto the rough, grassy terrain. Soon, he could see a single, massive soldier leading the ride. It was Varric. The giant knight was accompanied by another rider holding the high banner of Nostrador, as well as a third rider who had what looked like a body tied down to the back of his saddle, facing the ground. It was one of the elven prisoners. Was he using this prisoner for direction, or information, or simply for sport? Rian wondered, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. As he spurred his horse closer, he took a good look at the elf who lay helplessly on the back of the soldier's horse. The captive's face was badly bruised, and one of his eyes was swollen completely shut. Droplets of blood trickled down from his mouth, covering the back end of the horse he was attached to. Their wrists had been bound so tightly with rough rope that the strands had begun to cut deeply into their skin throughout the brutal journey. "Why is he up here?" Rian asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The soldier who had the prisoner glared fiercely at Rian and then turned his face back to the road. "Why do you think, General? He is going to show us the way, isn't that right?" Varric threw his heavy hand back, brutally striking the head of the elf, who let out a low, pained grunt. It was incredibly painful to watch. Rian winced every time he thought of what had been happening to these helpless captives, whether or not they truly deserved it. He felt with absolute certainty that this was not the way. "Are we going to stop at all before nightfall?" Rian questioned, trying his best to sound as commanding and authoritative as he could in his current situation. "The men will need to eat, to regain their strength." Varric looked to his fellow riders, who nodded back in return with blank expressions. "Course, once we get to the ruins of the bridge that connects us to Aethelgard, then we will make camp, away from the prying eyes of anyone who we hope is not watching," Varric replied coldly, before riding a little faster away from him to end the conversation entirely. Who exactly did Varric mean? Rian pondered the words. Did he mean the elves? Or was there something else out there in the dark that they should be worrying about? Camp, yes. This was good. It would be enough of a chance to figure out a plan, to discuss the situation with Garth, and potentially with Adora, too. If he could get any real information about where exactly they were headed from her, it might help immensely with what was about to transpire. He slowed his horse down, letting the passing companies gallop past him, before rejoining where he had previously been located near the rear. The companies had begun to slow down slightly as the light faded, but the ride was still going at a remarkably fast pace. Rian guided his horse to the side of the rattling cage that held Adora. She was lying miserably on her side, her knees held tightly against her chest to withstand the violent rocking of the cart. He got close enough so that he could talk to her, keeping his voice quiet enough as to not arouse the suspicion of the nearby soldiers who pulled her cart. "Are you okay?" he whispered against the wind. She did not stir at first. The caravan took a sudden slight bump as it rode over elevated ground, and the violent jolt seemed to awaken Adora into an alert state of mind. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked a second time, leaning down slightly from his saddle. She tried to speak, but the words caught painfully in her dry throat. She tried a second time with a little more success. "Water." Rian looked around for any unwanted, suspicious eyes first, before reaching for the leather water skin that was attached to his horse and yanking it off its strap. He then threw it through the gap in one of the crossed wooden bars gently, and it landed directly on her stomach. Immediately she rose to a sitting position, unfastened the cork with her bound hands, and threw her head back, pressing the cap of the water skin against her lips. For all she knew, it could have been deadly poison, but Rian guessed that in her current state of desperation, she would not have cared. Once she had drunk at least half of what remained in the skin, she fastened the cork back onto the leather pouch and held it back through the gap in the wood. "No, you keep that. You need it far more than I do," he said kindly. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice dropping as she stared ahead at the silver sea of the company. "Oh, you don't need to call me sir," he muttered in reply, feeling a strange pang of guilt. She turned fully to face him. Within her bound hands she held the water skin, caressing its worn leather pouch and tracing a specific shape with her finger upon it. A few seconds went by in absolute silence. It wasn't necessarily a bad silence, he felt. Something about being on the other side of this dire situation the elf found herself in felt strangely comforting. Even though a thick wooden cage stood physically between him and her, there was an honesty that tugged fiercely at his heart. It must have been the reason why he instinctively asked whether she was okay and gave away his water skin without a second thought. She leaned her back against the bars of the cage, facing away from Rian now, but more for physical comfort, as it seemed she wanted to stretch off any severe cramping that her legs were giving her. "So do you really not remember anything?" she asked softly into the dark. Rian looked down at his own hands gripping the leather reins. "Nothing. I get the odd snippet or a sudden flash of something. A feeling, perhaps, or a specific smell? Why do you ask? She hesitated to reply for a long moment, the wagon creaking loudly beneath her. You really don't remember me either? Rian looked towards her, his brow furrowing. Why would I? He said in return. He thought this was an incredibly odd and puzzling thing for her to suddenly say. A dark thought crossed his mind. What if she was the very one who had attacked him on the ridge, given him the severe injury, and made him forget his entire life? Would she even admit to it if she had? Suddenly she turned around violently to face him, her slender fingers gripping tightly onto the cage through the narrow gaps in the wood. Look at me, she pleaded, her emerald eyes locked onto his with terrifying intensity. Just look at me. It was remarkably hard for Rian to do anything other than concentrate on the treacherous ride in the plunging darkness. He found it strange that she was at least attempting to get him to say or do something specific. If anything, it was transparently clear that Adora was desperately trying to reveal something of immense importance to him. But what exactly was causing her not to speak the words? Varric was a good few feet away at the head of the army, and they were both speaking so quietly that he doubted any of the surrounding riders could hear them over the thunder of the hooves.